I'm starting to think that juicy and sad make up the landscape of our love relationship journey. Well, it would all make sense, right? Because we're conditioned to believe from childhood into our adulthood that love is supposed to be a fairy tale romance, isn't it? It's supposed to save us from our loneliness and rejection. That's why I've titled this season premiere episode of Love Relationships, Fairytales versus Marriage. Now, the fairy tale is what we want, and the marriage is what we get. So the question is, where does the madness me and mine are dealing with fit into all of that? We'll just be getting started with this conversation because this whole topic of love and fairy tales and marriage, the beginning and the end, and all that's going on in the middle, it's just a work in progress, honey. There is no end. So we're just going to get started on this episode of Love Relationships Real Talk. So buckle up because we're going in. So I've been wanting to have this conversation ever since I started this video blog, but I've been a little hesitant because it brings up the idea that maybe marriage isn't for everyone, and that maybe we've been conditioned to believe that marriage is an end result for relationships, period. When before I've talked in other videos about the fact that 9 out of 10 of the relationships we engage in don't work out. And it's supposed to be that way because relationships are specifically meant to help us become better human beings and to heal and grow. The marriage part might be an idea that wasn't so much a part of the plan brought on by the universe, but by man. Let me explain a little bit more of what I'm talking about. So this is what a marriage meme is. A meme in general, as you saw in the definition that came on at the beginning of the segment, a meme is an idea that society conditions us with from the time that we were born and to utilize in our lives. And so marriage is one of these memes. It's actually one of the bigger memes that we live by. So I've been a little hesitant to talk about this idea of a marriage meme because I don't want to present my perspective on it as if what I've chosen to do in my life is better than a person who's decided to get married. I completely believe in the institution of marriage, and I go to weddings, and I think it's a beautiful thing that process happens and that people make that decision to commit to each other. And on the other hand, as you can see in my own life, I am also open to the fact that people make other decisions besides marriage that still might look like a commitment, but not in the context that we've been conditioned to think is acceptable or not. And so the idea of a marriage meme, it really helped me to process the events that were occurring in my own relationship. I think sometimes we become so results-oriented around relationships that we don't really focus on the here and the now of what that relationship can provide for us. And so inside of this idea of a marriage meme, we're certainly conditioned to think that if you meet someone, you put time and care and attention and energy into a person and into a relationship, that you're supposed to get a certain result from that relationship, especially given a certain time frame. But I think a lot of times we get really focused on the things that we've been told, this context that marriage has been put into, and that we all expect and demand and make decisions around as a result, because we've been told that that's what relationships should come to. This point where you decide that you're going to spend the rest of your life together. You're going to get married, make it legal. In having this conversation, I found it difficult to formulate thoughts that would not make it seem like I was judging the idea of marriage, because I'm not. But I do want to give another perspective, or open up the conversation or our mindset outside of this idea of what we've been conditioned to think is supposed to happen in a certain time frame. And that's the breakdown of the marriage meme. And so actually I got really lucky during my hiatus from the show, where I had two experiences that helped me really formulate my ideas around marriage memes. So one of the stories that I experienced was on TV. Both of them actually were on TV. And so the first one that I want to share with you is the story of Princess Diana. Now this is the perfect example of what we have in our minds. Like, no one would actually ever think that we're going to marry a prince, because you can't. You have to be in London or some European country somewhere and born into a family, and so that's not going to happen. And so, but really, if we really think about it, really are honest with ourselves, when we think of the word marriage, a whole imagery comes through our minds, a whole sequence of events comes through our mind. And doesn't that start with the proposal and your engagement and the wedding day? And then your time together as husband and wife, and building a home, and then creating a family. Doesn't all of that imagery come into play when we say that one word, marriage? That's because we've been conditioned to think that that's what marriage looks like. We have the whole image and picture of what that should look like. And so here you have Princess Diana, and she's 19 years old, and she hasn't even started living her life yet. And she meets or knows of Prince Charles, who needs a wife. And he needs one now, because he's getting older and he needs to produce some heirs for the throne. Like I said, you have to be born into this royal family in order to be a prince or a princess. So he needs heirs, Prince Charles. And so this is the specific express purpose that he marries Princess Diana, because of this context that he's been put in. Like, theirs is even more extreme, right? So like, we're conditioned to think that we're supposed to get married at some point in time. Prince Charles, for an example, as a royal person living in London, is not only conditioned to think that he's supposed to get married, but there are all kinds of rules around the person he can or cannot marry. And in actuality, he was actually already in love with another woman when he came to the point in his life where he had to make this decision. And her name was Camilla Bowles, if you don't know the story. And he was in love with her. And he probably would have married her if he wasn't living inside of their European meme of marriage, royal marriage, that said he had to marry a particular person. So anyway, whether it was lucky or not, Diana happened to be the one. And she went into the situation from her side, I'm sure, as feeling completely out of her body and surreal around the fact that the prince wanted to marry her. That would make her a princess. Who doesn't want that, right? Who doesn't want to be the princess in this scenario? And so it means so many things when you get to be the princess, and it basically shapes the rest of your life. Come to find out, though, Diana didn't want that for her life. And she actually, throughout the whole duration of her marriage to Prince Charles, was miserable in that relationship and in that marriage. She was miserable to the point where she battled depression. She tried to commit suicide 5 times, and she suffered with bulimia. She just had a whole host of emotional problems that were tormenting her throughout this time because she knew that she was not being true to herself. And she knew that she didn't get the opportunity to develop and grow into who she was as a human being. And now she's in this place where she feels completely stuck, and people are looking at her like, you're the princess, what's the problem? Right? Like, why wouldn't you want that? And the reality is that it just wasn't for her. She did not want that. And as many of you know, her life story ended very sadly, in that a lot of the fantasy that was built around that particular relationship and the expectations that come with the fantasy, so for it to continue to look like a fantasy, all of those things that came with that relationship actually were the downfall to what would happen to Diana in the end. The media was a big part of her maintaining this image and showing people that fairy tales are real, which they're not. And she knew that. And so the media would chase her around all over the world, high-speed chases, and that's the thing that actually ended up killing her in the end, is that she was killed in a car accident during a high-speed chase as the paparazzi were trying to get a picture of her and her lover at the time. And she had many affairs, and so did Prince Charles, and continued to see Camilla Bowles and all of that. And it was all under the pretense of this idea of this royal union, that they were doing this. And that most definitely was based on a meme that said, this is how you're supposed to live your life, especially as a European royal person. But if you take the extreme out of that story and put the rest of that context onto your own mindset and how you live your life, and what expectations you might have for your future and your relationship, it's very similar. Those expectations, aren't they? What we want to see happen in our own relationships. It's not often at all that we go into relationships thinking that I'm so happy to be able to get the opportunity to do the work that I need to do to become a better human being. I'm so glad that I get the opportunity to be with this person, even in times where I would choose not to be, because their change doesn't look like what I expected it to be. And their growth and expectations for their own life doesn't look like what we had agreed upon initially at the beginning of our relationship. My own growth and expansion into who I am doesn't look like what my partner expected it to be. And for those reasons, we don't go into these unions of commitment that we call marriage with the idea that we can stay no matter what. Because we go in under the context of a meme, an expectation. I did too. I went into my relationship 100% seeing nothing else but the expectation that I was taught I should get after spending so much time in a relationship. Now that doesn't mean, I don't mean to say that you shouldn't do that. That's why this conversation is so touchy, right? I'm not saying that you shouldn't strive toward having this commitment that might look like marriage. But what I am saying is that if your relationship turns out not to look like what the textbook idea of what we think a relationship is supposed to result in, then take another look at what else you could possibly do to find happiness and sustain the beautiful things that you do have in your relationships that do help you become a better person and learn and grow more about who you are. And then maybe you don't have to give ultimatums like so many of my viewers have done with their partners, because they gotten to a point where they felt like they were running out of time, or they felt like their partner had run out of time. And so I've gotten so many letters where that question comes up: should I leave? Or should I stay and be with this person? Or do I need to just cut my losses and move on? Well, it just depends on what it is you're dealing with. For me, there was more advantages in staying in the relationship than leaving the relationship. Because in actuality, all I wanted was the fantasy. And I wasn't getting the fantasy. And that was a problem. And so when I realized that life isn't a fantasy anyway, and what I had in my relationship is what I would be looking for in another relationship if I did end my relationship with Mark and go out and look for another relationship so that I could get the marriage part of it, I'd be looking for the exact same thing that I had with Mark. I didn't want to take that chance. So I'm going to continue to discuss this whole idea of fairy tale and marriage and the decisions we make around that. The second piece that helped me formulate my ideas around this conversation, and that is the relationship that I saw on The Bachelorette with Rachel Lindsay. And so we're going to talk about that in part 2 of our season premiere of Love Relationships Real Talk. So you don't want to miss that, because it was good. And the questions and the dilemmas that were brought up for us in that were perfection, as we're sorting through what we need to do in our own love relationships. So tune in next time for part 2 of Fairy Tales versus Marriage on Love Relationships Real Talk. I'm Phoebe Smith. Don't forget to like my videos, leave the comment at the bottom there in the comment section, and as usual, as most of you do, email me, email address right here. See you next time.